On November 23, 1923, a tall, thin, 45-year-old man stood on the deck of his cargo ship off the coast of New York, waiting to be arrested. At the time, he was the most wanted man in America, but he had never actually broken the law. Bill McCoy was a modest boat builder who had become a national symbol for defying the most unpopular legislation in American history. This gentleman crook was the pioneer rum runner of the Prohibition era, a man of innovation and maritime tradition who fueled the Roaring Twenties by transporting liquor along the American coastline and challenging the U.S. government to a war on rum. McCoy was a new generation bootlegger who earned the name The Real McCoy because he always delivered undiluted alcohol. His whiskey, gin, and rum were always uncut, and his patrons loved him for it.
The legend of the real McCoy is that this was an honest man, a straight shooter, and if you bought booze from him, you wouldn't die or go blind.
He became a household name in less than a year and embarrassed U.S. authorities by constantly beating them at their own game.
We banned alcohol, and now it's everywhere, and it's the criminals who are making the profits, and it's corrupting public culture.
It is amazing the number of people who happily defied the law. If you think about it, what laws could we conjure up where 80–90% of the people who voted for it would then defy it?
McCoy confounded the Coast Guard by exploiting legal loopholes that kept the speakeasies of New York filled with the demon rum.
The Coast Guard was not prepared for Prohibition. They did not have the men, they did not have the resources as far as cutters and inshore craft to combat the amount of smuggling that was happening.
The king of Rum Row transported over 2 million bottles to slake America's thirst.
At this point, the Coast Guard had to catch Bill McCoy.
By the summer of 1923, Bill McCoy was becoming the government's primary target. He forced the Coast Guard to look at ways that smuggling could be done. I think it was Bill McCoy who galvanized the modern-day Coast Guard.
McCoy's transformation from modest boat builder to public enemy is a legendary tale about a man who personified the tumultuous years of Prohibition in America. Bill McCoy was one of the most romantic figures in an era of iconic personalities that yet define our national character.
And that's why they called him the real McCoy, and why his product was the real McCoy.
Bill McCoy was born in 1877 in Seneca Falls, New York. The son of a stonemason, he chose a life at sea over the footsteps of his father. He began his nautical adventure by entering the Philadelphia Maritime School at the age of 15, where he spent 2 years on the training ship USS Saratoga, crossing the Atlantic and learning the ropes for what would become a life at sea.
For 2 years, he was a cadet. He finished first in his class. Later on, he took his certificate and he ran vessels for wealthy people. Well, insofar as he was other things, such as a boat builder or even a clown, I suppose, at times, he was a leader, and those things sort of fell in behind that.
In his early 20s, McCoy returned to the family home in Holly Hill, Florida. He went into business with his older brother, Ben, designing and building boats for wealthy customers like Andrew Carnegie. They also ran excursion boats and delivered cargo between Daytona and Palm Beach, Florida. By 1919, a 42-year-old Bill McCoy fell in love and eloped with 20-year-old Maud Clock, the daughter of a prominent Daytona surgeon. Life was good for McCoy, but the winds of change were blowing in America, and the U.S. government was headed down a rabbit hole. 18th Amendment to the Constitution, implemented as the National Prohibition Act, went into effect on January 16, 1920, and it prohibited the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol in the United States. This forbidden fruit legislation had been fomenting since the early 1800s in reaction to the extreme poverty and domestic violence caused by an astonishing plague of alcoholism that was devastating American families. By the late 19th century, it was estimated that 20 gallons of hard alcohol were being consumed per year for every man, woman, and child in the United States. This was 8 times the level of alcohol consumption occurring today.
There's a huge temperance movement that's mostly directed inside native stock Protestant America. Very moralistic, very much arguing that men must change their habits to behave well and take care of their families.
As a result, there were many organizations advocating prohibition. But the primary forces at work were the Women's Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, and the Ku Klux Klan. These organizations inadvertently became strange bedfellows in a common struggle to maintain political control of America and enforce Protestant values on an increasingly diverse society. Protestant women took direct action by protesting in front of saloons and ushering their neighbors toward salvation. The great success of the women's uprising in the latter 19th century evolved into the women's suffrage movement, and a powerful political force was born. The Anti-Saloon League became the nation's first political action group. They mobilized the conservative religious base and paid thousands of professional lobbyists for several decades to influence the temperance vote on the local, state, and national level.
The Anti-Saloon League itself is an exceptionally sophisticated, in fact, it's a pioneering organization. And what they do is take this quite large, kind of diffuse, and I would argue basically religiously motivated constituency, and gives it very sharp political focus.
The Anti-Saloon League had the conviction that through moral reform, they could achieve social transformation. But the massive influx of Catholic immigrants to America's cities was shifting the population base from rural to urban and Protestant to Catholic.
Immigration begins to transform the country. And the people who arrive most notably are the Irish and the Germans. Both of them bring with them drinking cultures from Europe that are not like the drinking culture that had developed in America. Protestants don't like the way these immigrants are behaving.
The Ku Klux Klan responded to the wave of immigrants by attacking their drinking cultures. With over 4 million registered members, the Klan latched onto nationalism as America entered the 20th century. Since women didn't yet have the right to vote in this country, the vast membership of the Ku Klux Klan represented 15% of America's voting populace. And their position of intolerance toward immigrants became a powerful force for prohibition. Similar to the red and blue state divisions of today, prohibition became law in 31 rural states. And by 1919, the issue was then presented before Congress by the first-term Republican from Minnesota, Andrew Volstead. This collection of political factions also utilized the First World War as an ideological instrument. They lobbied that grain was for bread, not for drink, and created a schism that made the use of alcohol appear unpatriotic.
Prohibition is a symbol of the Protestant desire to have control of America and the upper class desire to have control of all these unruly poor people.
It was the wets versus the dries. But for the majority of Americans, it was forced sobriety. Many considered this social change through legislation a new form of tyranny. Millions of lives had been changed, and American society was in turmoil. Like the world around him, Bill McCoy's life was about to turn upside down. It began when the sluggish economy of 1920 forced the McCoy brothers into a financial corner. Wealthy clients commissioning new yachts were scarce. To make matters worse, Bill's beloved parents both died, and his wife Maud left him after only 6 months of marriage. But Bill McCoy, ever the optimist, came up with a new plan for business and adventure.
The first opportunity was when a man that he knew came along in a car that he didn't know. And the man was dressed up in a way he'd never seen him before. And this immediately intrigued him. How had this man come into all this money so suddenly? And the local fellow was very glad to tell him exactly how he did it. And he said he had done this by transporting liquor. And Bill thought, well, if this rather shiftless person can do this, I bet I could do this a lot better because I'm a hard worker and I know how to run boats. Now, although he was a teetotaler himself, Bill thought that the Prohibition law was ridiculous, and so he had no compunctions about breaking it. Furthermore, he knew that because the law was there, it would make whatever he did more profitable.
Since the McCoy brothers had great experience in transporting cargo by sea, and they saw little enforcement of this law from local authorities, the fun-loving McCoy convinced his conservative brother Ben that it would be a timely adventure.
Things were changing enough in his life so that when he had an opportunity to make money in a different way or slightly different way and still use boats, he was open to that.
So Bill traveled to Gloucester, Massachusetts with $20,000. He purchased the Henry L. Marshall, a 90-foot fishing schooner that needed a lot of work. Bill didn't know it at the time, but this would be the boat that would change America forever. During the 5 months it took to refit the Marshall, Bill stumbled across something unexpected, the love of his life. She was 114 feet long and weighed over 60 tons. Her name was Arethusa, and she transfixed Bill at first sight. She was the symbol of maritime elegance, but she was way out of his league, and Bill simply couldn't afford her. So he went back to the Henry L. Marshall, and with the conviction that only true love can inspire, Bill invigorated his plan to make a fortune at rum running and return later to buy the Arethusa. They set sail for the Bahamas on board the Marshall to find a load of liquor and begin their fateful quest. But there was yet another lady in McCoy's life, and she would create an encounter of a different sort. Back in Washington, D.C., Mabel Walker Willebrandt was appointed Assistant Attorney General in charge of prohibition enforcement. She was a woman in a man's world, and at a time when women didn't yet have the right to vote in America, having a female Assistant Attorney General was unusual, and many people in government underestimated her. This tenacious, intelligent Harvard graduate was one of the most powerful women in America, and she would stop at nothing to uphold the law.
Initially, she saw a lot of internal problems with corruption and the old boy network. When these seizures and captures took place, the Justice Department dropped the ball, and sometimes they were being bribed, and sometimes the cases weren't coming to trial.
Mabel encountered widespread corruption across every sector of law enforcement. Her ambition would be stifled by the good old boy network that permeated government at virtually every level. So she cleaned house and fired over 700 of her own agents and officers for bribery and corruption. She recruited a new breed of eager young law enforcement agents who wanted to rise quickly through the ranks of government and smash the corruption and greed of the previous generation. In favor of a national baptism by law. It would be a rebirth of the criminal justice system in America. And one by one, these true believers would strive to convert the mainstream and slow this destructive flood of corruption. These men were foot soldiers in an internal struggle to replace the inept with the industrious. They were more than just born-again officers. Their leadership would endeavor to destroy this American delirium. And they happily seized the opportunity to enforce the Prohibition law and reinvigorate the criminal justice system. But the law enforcement community wasn't the only dysfunctional sector of the government at that time.
Well, the Coast Guard has its everyday responsibilities as a life-saving service and as a customs enforcement unit. They did not have enough resources available to combat rum running and smuggling when Prohibition was enacted. But no one in the government nor the Coast Guard saw rum running coming.
In 1920, the fledgling Coast Guard was less than 5 years old, and it was ill-equipped to enforce this new law within the U.S. 3-mile jurisdiction. Lacking in vessels, crew, and strategy, the U.S. Coast Guard was stuck in a quagmire of red tape and was virtually powerless to enforce the law that was now on the books. And the government was blind to the fact that the rum war would be expensive. But since income tax in America at this time was relatively new, the loss of tax revenue from alcohol importers would reduce the U.S. government's only source of income by over 50%. Not everyone in the Coast Guard accepted this situation. High-ranking officers resisted enforcement of the law, and rebellious drinkers within the ranks protested the Prohibition law they were sworn to uphold. The Coast Guard faced an uphill battle, and it would take enormous political will to gain cooperation within the ranks and procure enough resources to combat the problem. The Coast Guard forced out many of the old-school officers and brought in a new breed of leader who would uphold the law. With law enforcement and the Coast Guard on the mend, Mabel Walker Willebrandt would soon become Bill McCoy's chief nemesis. "800 miles southeast of Washington, D.C., Bill McCoy and his crew on the Henry L. Marshall sailed into Nassau. They were the only seagoing vessel in a harbor steeped in mystery.
Well, one of the appeals of Nassau, I suppose, is that it has this colorful past. Most notably, it was a pirate haunt, in the early 1700s. Blackbeard was there, for instance, in 1717. And then she was quite prosperous in a decadent way.
But the prosperity of the Buccaneer era subsided when the British took control of the Bahamas. Half a century later, a new economic product started moving around the Caribbean, and Nassau became the chief way station in the slave trade.
By the time that McCoy got there, however, Nassau was mainly just a sleepy little fishing village.
In 1920, the Bahamas were part of the British Empire. And since there was no prohibition in Britain, Nassau was the ideal logistical and legal base for McCoy to operate. McCoy's first opportunity to move some liquor came when a man offered to charter the Marshall and bring a load of rye from the island of Bimini to Savannah, Georgia. So, in order to protect himself from U.S. authorities, McCoy paid the Nassau harbor master to register the Henry L. Marshall as a British vessel with duplicate transit papers. These papers stated that McCoy was moving liquor from one legal port to another, and the U.S. Coast Guard could not interfere. So in September of 1920, McCoy and his crew on the Henry L. Marshall set sail for the island of Bimini.
Bimini is not much more than a sand spit, and the key cultural place in Bimini was the Bimini Rod and Gun Club. In the cellar of this was all this rye. McCoy came sailing over from Nassau. He took a shortcut in the Henry Marshall through some of the shoals when it was daring do kind of sailing things. And he began to load this rye, but he stayed aboard the vessel making sure that nothing went wrong on that end. This is his first big trip.
With 1,500 cases of rye on board and the Union Jack proudly on display, the Henry Marshall headed up the warm blue road of the Gulf Stream to Savannah, Georgia. The real McCoy was now in uncharted waters, and he was about to make a big mistake.
McCoy was learning as he went along. On his trip north from Bimini to Savannah, he was still thinking like a sailor. He says, okay, well, you bring the boat into the shallow water, and I know how to do that. And it does not seem to occur to him that this was a foolish thing to do.
In the early 20th century, the territorial waters of the United States extended from the shoreline to 3 miles offshore. Any vessel that entered U.S. territorial waters was subject to the laws of the United States, including the Prohibition law.
At this point, McCoy hadn't figured out that he should really stay outside the 3-mile, as it was then, limit. And he took the Marshall inside to the shallow water there and was unloading it directly to very small boats. And a vessel came by in the mist there, and he thought it was a government vessel. And he thought, oh my God, first trip and we've been nailed right away. I'll never do this again. And he didn't. Fortunately for him, it was not a government vessel, and he was able to escape, but he learned that lesson.
McCoy had unloaded all 1,500 cases of rye at Savannah, and in 2 weeks' time had earned $15,000 profit, which was more money than he could make in 5 years as a boat builder. He also realized that as long as he stayed in international waters, he wouldn't actually break any laws.
You have to remember that this is a business transporting stuff like anything else. And so there's many stages, many different departments that do this. And the more you can keep it compartmentalized, if you're someone like McCoy, in your own mind, the better off you are, particularly legally later on.
Bill McCoy had a strict code of honor, and he refused to transport other contraband like drugs or illegal aliens. But he rationalized his participation in rum running by maintaining a legal operation and distancing himself from his gangster clients. He quickly sailed back to Bimini, where his charter client reloaded the Marshall with 3,000 more cases of bourbon, and they went to New York, where they arranged for small boats known as contact boats to go through U.S. territorial waters out to the Henry L. Marshall. Then McCoy unloaded the liquor in the relative safety of international waters.
And this is the first time McCoy had really done this kind of operation, using motorboats to ferry the stuff back and forth. And they unloaded that vessel that night. So that was the defining moment for the whole era, because it allowed an infinite supply of booze to come into the United States. Prior to that, there was a very finite amount of liquor in the United States in bonded warehouses and stuff that could be made in the backwoods and stills.
On that voyage, the Henry L. Marshall became the first rum runner to unload large quantities of illegal liquor off the coast of the United States, and Bill McCoy had just invented rum roll.
Now, that event did not go unnoticed by other people who were interested in making money in this fashion, and so McCoy began to have many imitators, and you began to see, after that, all kinds of boats laying out there off the New York shore.
In a matter of months, dozens of McCoy imitators flocked to Rum Row to fuel the incredible growth of gin joints in Manhattan. They created a floating world, an alternate society within sight of the metropolis of New York. McCoy recognized the opportunity and borrowed money from his gangster clients to buy the Arethusa, and eventually 3 other boats that would comprise McCoy's defiant armada.
At this point, I don't think the gangsters had the reputation that they did later on, and he could still compartmentalize a bit there and think that, well, this is just a loan, and loans come from bankers and bankers or whatever, you know. Later on, he took much pains to deal with gangsters as little as possible, which is why all these myths of Capone and him sitting on porches together and stuff seemed to me bogus.
Like the Henry L. Marshall, Coy registered Arethusa as a British vessel, and he renamed her Tomoka. But he always thought of her by her original name, Arethusa, for she was an aristocrat, a thoroughbred, and she sailed straight into McCoy's heart. But managing a bootleg armada with dozens of crew members wasn't an easy task. He started to buy his own booze, and he bypassed the middleman and made arrangements directly with the buyers to meet him on Rum Row in their contact boats. He invented more efficient methods of packing liquor bottles to maximize each payload. And he began making regular trips from Nassau to New York every month, adding to the ever-growing club of bootleggers on Rum Row.
Well, at the maximum amount, you know, they had about 100 boats. It was like the Yale-Harvard Regatta out there or something, you know. It was quite festive. Eventually, they would bring jazz bands out to these various boats, and they were running the girls back and forth. Then they had daily newspapers keeping up with what was going on, and fruit and meals and the whole thing that was out there.
Well, in early Prohibition days, most of the people who were running liquor at sea were ex-mariners and ex-fishermen, and some people have called Prohibition the first fisherman subsidy program the government's ever had.
And so while there were hundreds of boats out there on Rum Row on any given day, there were very few that actually were doing it in such a way that they could maintain this business day after day, trip after trip. So McCoy began to develop a reputation for reliability because he would always be there and he would have good product because he would not cut the product.
The phrase Rum Row was catching on, and like Skid Row, the negative connotation of the name became a catch-all phrase for any collection of boats selling illegal liquor outside the U.S. 3-mile limit. Rum Row extended from New Jersey to the tip of Long Island, and sometimes off cities like Miami, Savannah, Norfolk, and Boston.
It was a hodgepodge of people. Life was pretty good on the Row.
McCoy and the other rum runners developed new technology to fight the war on rum. They built false bottoms in their contact boats to hide the liquor. They installed rheostats to dim the lights at night. And they replaced their 50-horsepower motors with 500-horsepower Liberty aircraft engines, essentially inventing the speedboat in order to outrun the Coast Guard.
Now, when you have the old workboat engines and the Coast Guard with their Stirling engines, they're not much more than that. You sort of go chugging along, bump, bump, like this, like a couple of ducks chasing each other. Then you put these Liberties in here, and zoom!
Since radio communication was still in its infancy, most of the Coast Guard vessels didn't have radios in those days, which made it even easier for the rum runners and normal, law-abiding citizens who sometimes got into the act.
It was a very tempting situation, but I think the fishermen were always aware, you know, that just one false step and they would lose their boat and then they would lose everything. Well, you could make in one night, if you're a fisherman, $2,000, $2,500, something like that. You'd be lucky to make that in a year. When one of the vernacular local boats was spotted by the Coast Guard, he couldn't really outrun him. He'd just have to hope that the Coast Guard, in maybe an 83-footer or the smaller picket boats, would not find what was aboard. They used to hide the stuff under the fish. And if you ever, you know, poke through a pile of fish, it's not very appetizing. There's all kinds of stories about good citizens, you know, finding this stuff, and they would bring it up on the beach when the Coast Guard wasn't around. And one of the more interesting stories is they would plant the bottles in their gardens, and to keep track of rye and gin and so forth, they would put like peas for gin and carrots or something for rye, the little things you use in the garden. Then when guests would come to dinner or something, they'd go out and they'd say, go out and dig up some carrots, and they'd bring whatever it was in there.
But back on Rum Row, Bill McCoy set the price for liquor. Since his booze was always uncut, he got top dollar. And the deck of Arethusa looked like the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, as supply and demand on Rum Row was based on McCoy's published rates. So many boats came and went. McCoy never had time to count the wads of money shoved into his hands, or even track the number of cases going over the side. His clients became his friends, and at the end of every trip, the money always added up. There was honor among these seafaring brothers. The news media grabbed hold of the story and made heroes of the rum runners and embellished their stories of camaraderie and daring do. The media cast Bill McCoy in a glamorous light, and after only a short time at sea, The legend of the real McCoy had become a national obsession. Bill McCoy had become bigger than the Coast Guard, and something needed to be done.
This was a time period when the federal government started collecting intelligence. Prohibition was the beginning of the intelligence movement spying on the American people.
The Coast Guard and federal authorities began inspecting boatyards. They wanted to find out how the rummies were making such fast boats. So they went undercover in Brooklyn, Mystic, and Gloucester, and began arresting boat builders for creating vessels that could outrun the Coast Guard.
A good example of a particular yard and how it fits into this modification of the rum runners is at the Franklin Post Yard in Mystic, Connecticut. And they were good people who built good boats, but the fact is it became more and more difficult to make a living building legitimate boats. And so they took on some work. And the Coast Guard came by and they said, well, obviously you're building a rum runner. And they arrested Franklin Post, and they took him to court. And the Post fought it and says, how can you say it's a rum runner? It's never even been in the water. That's like arresting an unborn baby as a criminal. And they won the case. The Post Yard won the case.
The rum war became a technological battlefield. Now this is hard to imagine, but the criminals had more money than the U.S. government, and they began to design and build new boats to run the blockades and embarrass the Coast Guard.
I'm sure it was very discouraging to see a boat going 40 knots, 35 knots, and not being able to apprehend them. The Coast Guard could maybe go 20 knots. I said, you gotta be kidding me. We can't fight this war.
The news media made McCoy look like a hero, and the Coast Guard looked like the Keystone Cops. So the Commandant of the Coast Guard testified before Congress to request an unprecedented $14 million. They needed to build a new fleet and take control of U.S. territorial waters.
Congress and President Coolidge recognized that the Coast Guard needed additional funds so that they could combat the rum war. So they earmarked about $14 million to build additional cutters and to almost double the size of the Coast Guard. And COY doubled the size of the Coast Guard.
The Coast Guard naturally tried to keep up with the technology, and so they would get a government contract out and they would say, let's have more horsepower, let's talk to the Sterling people, we gotta have better engines.
But the rummies were more adaptable than the government, and they exploited the snail pace of the government contract system.
The rummies would walk over and they'd look at what they're doing and say, okay, that's what we have to beat. And since they didn't have government contracts, they could just, take some cash out of the back of the car and lay it on the guy. They'd say, okay, do a little bit of this, a little bit more of that. And the Coast Guard guy watches all this and he says, well, in 6 months, maybe we'll have one that would have beat this guy 6 months ago. So the Coast Guard realized that the only way they could keep up with the rum runners was to capture rum-running boats and convert them. And there's a whole list of them where they did this, including the famous Black Duck. Now, the only way they could capture them was to ambush them, because they could never pursue and capture them.
Because of the bureaucratic delays and political red tape, the development of a whole new fleet moved along at a snail's pace. So the rummies kept right on going, and they forced the Coast Guard to adopt a new tactic. They started shooting at the contact boats.
Coast Guard was just trying to get their attention because these guys driving the boats couldn't hear. These engines were so loud, they couldn't hear the Coast Guard firing at them. So at night, they'd fire tracer bullets and they'd shoot over the bow and just try to get their attention. And once in a while, they've killed people. They killed people.
At this point, McCoy was making dozens of trips back and forth from Nassau to Rum Row. And an entire industry of liquor importers began to set up shop in Nassau to ply their goods to McCoy. and his growing list of imitators. The customs house in Nassau began to charge a $6 per case importation tax, and the Bahamian government began to make a killing. They built new docks, created lots of jobs, and McCoy even became a local hero. He also convinced the U.S. ambassador to the Bahamas to get into the act.
McCoy went to the American consul, a man named Lathrop, and he became friends with him. Now, Nassau was a sleepy subsistence place for shallow draft vessels in the area, and here McCoy was bringing in a deep draft Gloucester schooner, so the U.S. consul made arrangements so that the American taxpayers could help pay for the dredging of Nassau Harbor so that McCoy could bring in illegal liquor in defiance of the American laws. The interesting thing about prohibition, I suppose many crimes, is that the left hand often pretends not to know what the right hand is doing. So we have an economic project going here, and that's always a good thing to have, right? Now, what happens with these products is not necessarily my concern, Lathrop could say. Where the rockets come down, said Werner von Braun, right? It's not my department.
Meanwhile, a new visitor arrived in Nassau. U.S. Customs Agent Pete Sullivan showed up, looking to collect intelligence on Bill McCoy. But McCoy was hard to find among the growing crowd of bootleggers, mobsters, and nefarious characters who had descended on Nassau.
Pete Sullivan, while down in Nassau, went to the Lucerne Hotel, which was the bootleggers' headquarters, and he was fingered as being a federal agent. So his life was threatened, and they were going to kill him. But it was McCoy who came to his rescue and said, no, he's a friend of mine, he's on the square. McCoy put him in his room, let him sleep there for the night, and put him on the first ferry to Miami the next day.
McCoy lived by a strict moral code. He had to save Pete Sullivan's life. This is what makes McCoy different from other criminals of the time period.
The other iconic criminals of the period were basically energized by a kind of pathology, it seems to me. People such as John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Machine Gun Kelly, and then the big city syndicate people like Al Capone. McCoy was cut from a very different cloth. He was not, first of all, psychotic. Second of all, his impulses were positive. He was an innovator and loved nature and working with the wind and those forces. Completely different than someone running around in a car shooting people. McCoy certainly was not a violent man.
Back in New York, the crew of the Henry L. Marshall was being arrested, and the boat was impounded for selling illegal liquor. The problem began when the captain of the Marshall went ashore. He got drunk in a speakeasy and bragged about selling booze to one of Mabel Walker Willebrandt's undercover agents. The agent notified the Coast Guard, and they captured the Marshall in international waters, citing that the Marshall had illegal exchange with small contact boats from the U.S., and it was this exchange that placed the Marshall in violation of U.S. law.
The Coast Guard felt it had enough jurisdiction to go out and seize the Marshall, even though the Marshall was in international waters.
But the U.S. government claimed that shore contact constituted an illegal act, and the owners of the vessel, Bill and Ben McCoy, were indicted in New Jersey.
By the summer of 1923, Bill McCoy was becoming the government's primary target. He forced the Coast Guard to look at ways that smuggling could be done, and McCoy was the first case the Coast Guard had. The government had good reason to silence his legend. He became the face of Rum Row.
They found that if they could get McCoy, they could pretty much turn things around because he was, after all, the symbolic leader. Just the same way that a few years later, they created the idea of public enemy number one with Dillinger and people like that. They would concentrate on one person because they figured they could nail him, then they would get this great moral victory.
So Mabel Walker Willebrandt decided that Bill McCoy would become the first public enemy of the Rum War.
The Department of Justice was eager to get this case to the trial because it would set a precedent because Henry Marshall was captured outside a 3-mile limit in international waters. And at that time, the Department of Justice was trying all sorts of tricks to test the legality of methods of capture.
McCoy rose to the challenge and hired expensive lawyers to battle in the courts for the release of the Henry L. Marshall. Every bootlegger on Rum Row followed the news stories, and they started moving farther offshore. If the Marshall case held up in court, the loophole McCoy had invented would be closed, and the government would be able to legally arrest them 12 or even 50 miles offshore, regardless of their documents or country of registration. Despite the mounting difficulty on Rum Row, the demand for liquor in New York increased. Instead of reducing liquor consumption, Prohibition caused the number of liquor establishments in New York City to double in the first year. Diverse groups of everyday business people, hardened criminals, blacks, whites, men and women all came together in a melting pot of self-indulgence known as the Speakeasy, where jazz music infused a decadent new subculture of defiant drinkers. And the first social insurrection in American history began.
Prohibition was probably the first time in American history where people were openly violating the law, and it became fashionable to break the law.
It is amazing the number of people who happily defied the law. If you think about it, what laws could we conjure up where 80, 90% of the people who voted for it would then defy it? Americans showed that if a law didn't work for them in daily life, then they really weren't going to follow it. And it wasn't with any sense of high morality. This isn't Martin Luther King saying an unjust law is a law that doesn't have to be followed. This is people saying, oh heck, I want to drink. This is a law that just doesn't work for me.
Emancipated young women known as flappers moved to New York City and horrified their suffragette mothers by finding jobs, renting their own apartments, and personifying American independence.
The 1920s is a tremendous decade of change, and some people would say progress for women and women's rights. The ability to live as a single woman in a city, for example, is a trend that begins in the 1920s. But young women also don't have to belong to a father or a brother or a husband or a boyfriend, but to be on their own. The flapper comes out of this new sense of young women's independence. Once those cats are out of the bag, it's pretty hard to put them back inside.
The carefree excesses of the 1920s seem to dominate today's media image of the time period. In reality, the average citizen at this time was living in poverty.
The 1920s is widely misunderstood as a time when everyone was partying, everyone was having a good time. But we have to remember that, because there was significant poverty in significant sectors of American society in the 1920s.
For most Americans, the 1920s was an exercise in survival. Thousands of people died from contaminated alcohol. Crime skyrocketed, and American society began to slide toward the Great Depression. But out of turmoil, opportunity was born, and enterprising criminal organizations found it easy to recruit foot soldiers who had nothing to lose in this time of chaos. So the rum game became big business, and some heavy hitters moved in on Rum Row.
This was the inception, the beginning of organized crime. When things started escalating and piracy and hijackers became part of the norm, it kind of turned dark and dangerous.
The small operators began to be forced out by the big syndicates.
Rum Row was becoming a really dangerous place. Many times the gangs would just come aboard and shoot everybody and sink the boat. They would just vanish. Nobody knew whatever happened to them.
But hijackers were only half the problem on Rum Row. By now, the Coast Guard had finally received the assets they needed to fight the rum war. they implemented a picket line strategy, using a combined fleet of destroyers, gunboats, 75-footers, 36-footers, and harbor craft. Hundreds of ships were used to disperse the rum fleet and impede their resupply efforts in order to starve out Rum Row.
Here a cutter is picketing a smuggler at sea outside the legal zone. Such picketing has proved successful in preventing the landing of contraband. Rum runners and the like are carefully watched until shortage of food and fuel force them back to their home port.
In the end, the Coast Guard boats would outnumber the boats on Rum Row, and they became more effective in pursuing contact boats in U.S. territorial waters. This new strategy was beginning to work, and the Coast Guard had survived the worst period of mismanagement and government red tape in U.S. military history.
Once the Coast Guard got the assets and became organized, it was that point that the Coast Guard started becoming the Coast Guard we know today.
Coast Guard captains could now avenge the scorn and ridicule they received from the rum runners. These were honorable men, conducting a difficult and unpopular task. So they shed their Keystone Cops image and cut off the rum fleet from their supply lines, forcing the contact boats to dump their cargo rather than get caught with the goods. The tide was changing, and hundreds of spotlights were searching for Bill McCoy. McCoy decided it was time to skip town for a while. They sailed the Arethusa to Halifax, Nova Scotia, only to find that U.S. and Canadian authorities had begun their dry diplomacy, and McCoy's boat full of liquor wasn't welcome in Canadian waters. Their limited supply of provisions forced McCoy and his crew to sail to the nearest friendly port, the French-owned island of St. Pierre, up the coast of Newfoundland. The only problem was, McCoy didn't have a nautical chart to get there, so he used a road map.
Now, of course, to be using a road map to do maritime navigation is at best a risky business. I mean, you usually see on these things these days, do not navigate by this map, because it's not precise enough, it doesn't have any soundings, it doesn't show all the things you could bump into on the way, in other words. And there's where his skill showed.
As soon as McCoy arrived, he knew that St. Pierre would be the other end of the rum line.
And now he had the French islands, which were very close by the Great Circle route to Scotland and the Scotch and the wines of France and all of that good stuff. And so he could just move from one end to the other, pausing in between off New York, and offload there, with Nassau on one end and St. Pierre on the other.
This was the high point of the rum game for Bill McCoy. He now had 5 boats making regular trips from Nassau to Rum Row, to St. Pierre, and back to Rum Row. In August 1923, Captain Ryan of the Coast Guard cutter Manhattan spotted Arethusa just outside U.S. territorial waters. Since McCoy was already wanted in New Jersey in connection with the capture of the Henry L. Marshall, Captain Ryan sent an undercover crew to apprehend McCoy. But they didn't know that McCoy had just recently purchased guns to protect himself from hijackers. And McCoy didn't like the look of these guys.
The Coast Guard claimed he actually fired at them with a machine gun. McCoy, he always said that he thought that it was a hijacker. And the Coast Guard always claimed that McCoy damn well knew that they were the Coast Guard. But how this would be possible, you could make a case both sides because they were not in uniform and it was like an unmarked cruiser, you might say. But this was the thing that really cinched it.
McCoy was protecting himself from the hijackers, but it was the biggest mistake of his life.
At this time, they didn't have the terminology of public enemy number one, but if they had, it would have been Bill McCoy. And I guess the Department of Justice started working with the Department of State, which started working with the Department of Treasury to all kind of focus in and narrow in on Bill McCoy.
At this point, the Coast Guard had to catch Bill McCoy.
So McCoy and his crew set sail for Nassau.
After the Coast Guard incident, which at the time he did not take seriously, he simply went down to Nassau on Arethusa to make his usual run. At that time, there was a glut in the Scotch market, and ironically, he found a British firm selling rye, which is basically an American concoction, and he got together with that particular company through a woman named Gertrude Lithgow. She herself was a Midwestern American who had an uncanny resemblance to Theda Barry, the actress who was playing the role of Cleopatra in the movies. So Gertrude was known as Cleo or Cleopatra. She had a wonderful foundation, though, as a business person. She'd come up through stenography and bookkeeping and so forth, so she was very competent and way ahead of her time. She didn't let anybody push her around. She packed a pistol, very independent woman. Now, she was having trouble unloading her rye, which is not because there wasn't a market for it, but because the other males in the distribution business in Nassau were trying to shoulder her out. Well, they were trying to shoulder each other out as well, but they thought they could get away more with that sort of bullying thing with a woman. So there was a nice opportunity for McCoy and Cleo Lithgow to get together and help each other out.
McCoy took the deal, and he decided to transport all 1,500 cases of rye from Nassau to Rum Row.
She, at the last minute, surprised him, actually. She rode out on the launch to the Arethusa with the cargo and then sent the launch home and stayed on the schooner, which is a great shock to McCoy. She wanted to make sure that she could supervise the offloading of this up on Rum Row. And that was really unheard of for a respectable woman to do that, particularly with these renegade watermen crew that the rum runners had, even McCoy. Now, once they got on board, I mean, they were sailing away. It was a beautiful day and all of that, but night came and there was the whole matter of the sleeping arrangements. McCoy had a very large cabin, which had two sides to it, of course, and he bunked her on one side and he was on the other. And there was a cabin boy who slept on the floor in between. Some of the other things that happened on that voyage because of her presence was that the crew began to act much more gentlemanly. They cut out the bad language. There was a cook named Frenchie who had, on an earlier trip on a different boat, shot another rum runner in the stomach and kicked him overboard. He became extremely polite and made delicate dishes just for her, which sort of nonplussed McCoy because he never did that for him. In the evening on the fantail, they would all gather together and Frenchie played his violin and his accordion, and they all sang songs. As McCoy said, it was like a Sunday school picnic. To Gertrude, of course, this is the high point of her life, really, and in her autobiography, she certainly frames it that way. She was fascinated with what was going on out there, even the more routine parts of it, and she has these wonderful descriptions of the contact boats coming through like butterflies blowing across the bay, things like that. And she developed a wonderful relationship with Old Faithful, McCoy's dog. They sort of became companions. At that time, most of the people that came to the Arethusa were in boats, but there was also some seaplanes that came in, which were very unusual at the time. Now, you couldn't get much in a seaplane, but if what you got in was the real McCoy, that made the trip worthwhile. After a week on Rum Row, Gertrude's cargo had pretty much sold out, and Bill was able to get her a ride to shore with his brother Ben to wire that money. She then took a taxi cab to the Waldorf Astoria, soaking wet from the launch trip in, and with all that money, and it was very difficult for her to get anybody, the cab driver and the clerk at the hotel, to take her seriously at first. Now, once she got back down to the Caribbean, the rumors about her taking this trip with McCoy began to have a life of their own. By then, her story had gotten out. It was published in newspapers of wide circulation, and Gertrude Lithgow found out that she was the Queen of Rum Row.
Meanwhile, the well-known white-hulled Arethusa had become conspicuous on Rum Row, and the Coast Guard took notice. But McCoy was not intimidated. He unloaded all but 155 cases of rum right under their noses. Although McCoy could see the cutter Seneca nearby, he felt she deserved no respect, for she was a graceless, chubby metal craft, and his beautiful Arethusa could outrun her any day. What he didn't know is that he'd become the most significant law enforcement target in America. He also didn't know the U.S. government had secretly negotiated a treaty with Great Britain, allowing the U.S. Coast Guard to arrest McCoy in international waters, even though Arethusa was flying the British flag. So following instructions from Mabel Walker Willebrandt to capture McCoy at all costs, the captain of the Seneca steered his ship into international waters, and he stormed the Arethusa.
Raise the anchor! Get those sails up!
Prepare to fire. Stand by.
Before McCoy even noticed, Seneca had blocked the escape route.
And fire.
Seneca pinned Bill McCoy in about 6.5 miles off Seabright, New Jersey, and sent a boarding party over. The Coast Guard sent a Lieutenant Perkins. He was the boarding officer and the arresting officer of Bill McCoy.
The lowest point of his life, I have to think, is when Lieutenant Perkins ordered McCoy's crew to take down the sail, and they looked at McCoy, and then they took down the sail because Perkins told them to.
Yeah, it was the saddest day of Bill McCoy's life. His beloved Arethusa was under the command of the U.S. Coast Guard.
So here's McCoy. He's taken by the second officer of a steamboat in a rowboat.
On November 23, 1923, the Robin Hood era of Rum Row came to an end. Prohibition would continue for another 10 years. But for Bill McCoy, the rum running was over.
This was a momentous event in the Rum War. I think it was a feather in everyone's cap to have gotten Bill McCoy. Mabel and even the administration, they got their man.
While awaiting trial, McCoy was visited by U.S. Customs Agent Pete Sullivan, an unexpected friend who came to repay his debt to McCoy for saving his life back in Nassau the year before. Sullivan used McCoy's fame to help his cause. He took Bill on a tour of Washington, D.C., so that congressmen, federal agents, judges, and even Mabel Walker Willebrandt could shake hands with the real McCoy.
McCoy was this figure of fascination with the federal government, that they want to know who this real McCoy was, this gentleman rum runner. And so people were eager to be McCoy. He was a rock star. He was a celebrity.
Mabel Willebrandt offered McCoy a deal if he would plead guilty and cooperate with the Justice Department.
He knew the politicians, and he knew the syndicate boys, and he knew the little guy down the road who picked the stuff up on the shore. Everybody, the whole line from one end to the other. And he, more than anybody, could have really ratted all of that system out.
So he took the deal and admitted his own guilt. But he refused to become a snitch. He was able to negotiate the charges being dropped against his brother Ben in exchange for pleading guilty.
Now, there's a temptation, of course, on the part of anyone when you're arrested, even for going through a stop sign, to drop the dime, as they used to say. He resisted all that. He didn't do that. And I think he didn't do it because it just wasn't within his character to do that. He was a very old-fashioned guy in that respect. While we don't think of McCoy as very introspective and complicated in that way, he managed to navigate through many different temptations, and in a sense, was a very richly complex person who maintained his moral center through all of this. And that is indeed a rare person.
So his brother Ben got to walk free, and on March 25, 1924, Bill McCoy entered the Essex County Jail in New Jersey to serve a 9-month sentence. But life in jail was not very difficult for the famous McCoy. There's evidence that he spent several nights in the boarding house down the street from the jail with someone named Mrs. McCoy. And he was even spotted at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, with the warden of his prison attending the Walker Shade prize fight.
You know, and the funny thing about this, I don't think that Warden Blue was even paid off to do that. I just thought he thought, hey, this is fun, let's do this. I got Bill McCoy, let's go to the fights.
But they were immediately spotted by the press. And the next day, Bill McCoy and Warden Blue ended up on the cover of the newspaper.
Of course, when that happened, the politicians had a lot of fun with that, and the poor warden lost his job, and they transferred McCoy down to another jail.
McCoy was going to be released early on good behavior, but after the boxing match incident, he had to stay in jail for the entire 9-month sentence. On Christmas Day, 1924, the 9 months was up, and Bill McCoy finally got his life back.
So the time comes, and there's Ben. Faithful Ben picks him up, and they drive down to Florida, and they're back for New Year's Eve.
The McCoy brothers spent the rest of their lives living modestly together in the family house in Holly Hill. There's no evidence that Bill or Ben McCoy were ever involved in rum running after the prison term, and Bill always claimed that all the money he made running 170,000 cases of alcohol was spent on lawyers. So the McCoy brothers returned to the boat building business, dabbled in Florida real estate, and eventually became philanthropists, preserving several important historical ships and donating a set of Belgian chimes to their mother's temperance church. In the 9 years after McCoy got out of prison, the rum war continued to rage without him. The battle lines kept pushing further out to sea, but the government was never completely successful in stopping the rum runners. The big bootlegging syndicates devised virtually invisible ships, high-powered radio stations, and even developed plans for submarines. There was always a way, and the demon rum never stopped flowing. But the political tides were shifting. The Great Depression shattered the nation's economy, which was already strapped by the rum war. Overzealous Coast Guard crews continued to kill rum runners, many of whom were unarmed local fishermen. And the carnage of the Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago all contributed to the perfect political storm known as repeal.
What would rip the rhetorical underpinnings out from Prohibition is that people wouldn't obey the law. That's what was unanticipated. We banned alcohol, and now it's everywhere, and it's the criminals who are making the profits, and it's corrupting public culture. That's a whole series of new arguments against having it.
So the dry politicians, in an attempt to save face, offered repeal of Prohibition to be determined by popular vote, rather than stand up to the scrutiny of their wet congressional opponents. On April 4th, 1933, the 21st Amendment won the popular vote. Prohibition was repealed, and the biggest party in American history overflowed into the streets. President Hoover described Prohibition as the noble experiment, but it failed miserably, and instead of helping American society, it managed to add to the social problems it was designed to mitigate. The unintended results of the noble experiment included increases in homelessness, corruption, alcoholism, and death. The Volstead Act is also credited for spawning the plague of organized crime in the United States. Besides Prohibition, no other constitutional amendment has ever been repealed. But there are many examples of special interest groups influencing public law in an attempt to be a wellspring of action. But the Prohibition law is the perfect example of how destructive this theory can be.
America is a pluralistic country, and the values of large groups of the population have to be acknowledged. So an attempt by a substantial minority of the population to outlaw drinking isn't going to fly. Prohibition gets mocked in history because it's associated with the rural, with the Protestant, with the obsolete, with the fundamentalist. But what we remember about it is that it was intolerant. So part of the lesson of Prohibition is that inclusion is good, mutual respect, mutual tolerance, acceptance of the preferences of others under controlled circumstances.
In hindsight, we can finally see the primary cause of a problem and fully learn the lessons of our past.
I think the most important lesson is for us to be very cognizant of the kinds of backlash legislation, conservative legislation that can come to the forefront in a time of war and in its immediate aftermath. We have to be very careful not to react in repressive ways because of a traumatic experience of war. And war is deeply, deeply traumatic to the fabric of any society.
The Prohibition era was a make-or-break environment for the careers of thousands of politicians, law enforcement agents, and military commanders, especially those who were somehow connected to the fame of Bill McCoy. Lieutenant Perkins, the arresting officer of Bill McCoy, later became Admiral Perkins. Pete Sullivan was promoted to Director of the U.S. Customs Marine Patrol. But Mabel Walker Willebrand, the pioneer of Prohibition enforcement, was somehow forgotten. Despite all her accomplishments against impossible odds, Mabel Willebrand never received any public recognition from the government for her leadership in the war on rum. She remains to this day an unsung hero of law enforcement in America. She quietly left the Justice Department in 1928, and since she'd made enemies of the good old boy network in Washington, she had to make her own way and start a private law practice, ultimately becoming lawyer to the stars and taking a job with Amelia Earhart. But whatever happened to Arethusa? The Grande Dame of the rum fleet was impounded after her capture and later auctioned by the U.S. government. Bill McCoy never saw her afloat again, but he knew that she was in Nova Scotia, back in the fishing trade. Then one day, unexpectedly, he received word that his true love had died. Arethusa had wrecked on Sambro Ledge near Halifax, Nova Scotia. So he went to her. He walked the beach and found the remains of the only thing he had ever really loved.
This was his one true love, the Arethusa. And when she was gone, he did a very interesting thing. Instead of taking that piece of the Arethusa home and putting it on his own mantelpiece, he took it to the Gloucester Fishermen's Association because he recognized that the most important thing about the Arethusa was that she was the queen of the Gloucester fishing fleet and not his getaway car. And he gave her up to that tradition which he considered higher than himself.
Arethusa had become an important part of American history, not for her participation in rum running, but for who she was.
Arethusa was the symbol of maritime elegance. And by elegance, I mean the perfect example of form and function in a working craft. Everything on Arethusa worked and was beautiful.
Her image lives on in some of the most prestigious institutions in America. There's a model of her at the Mystic Seaport. Her ship's plans are on exhibit at the Smithsonian Institution, And that famous image of the Gloucester fisherman is actually the wheel of Arethusa, with her first owner, Clayton Morrissey.
She's not just a frilly yacht, in other words. The tradition of the great Gloucester fishing schooners and the whole industry that represented, and a kind of iconic American ingenuity and forthrightness and all of those good things.
A few years after putting Arethusa to rest, Bill McCoy contracted food poisoning. As a remedy, the doctors prescribed a deadly combination of bismuth and arsenic. After 3 days of enduring this agonizing treatment, Bill McCoy died at the age of 71 aboard his boat in Stuart, Florida.
I think what McCoy gives us is an outlaw who is not a psychopath and who is actually truly closer to the Robin Hood figure. So we were looking, see, in the early 30s for positive heroes who somehow were on the outside, because so many people began to feel like they were on the outside in the 30s. There's a strong strain in American culture, starts right with the Revolution, does it not, that somehow we are outlaws but good guys. That's a hard thing to maintain. So I think we can learn by looking at McCoy a way to maintain a kind of integrity in hard times when we don't necessarily agree with the establishment. And these were times when the government was not necessarily the moral exemplums, that you could just simply say, well, whatever, the president says is okay.
The Prohibition era was a challenging time for Americans. It was a decade of social introspection, and Bill McCoy became an iconic moral barometer, as complex and controversial as the era itself. His legacy as the real McCoy will live on.
McCoy never compromised his product. He never cut his booze. In contrast to his competition, who often cut booze with all kinds of wicked chemicals, including turpentine or wood alcohol, and McCoy never did that. And that's why they called McCoy's product the real McCoy, because it was good, unadulterated Scotch whiskey. In contrast to the razzmatazz and rat-a-tat-tat of the rum business ashore, aboard one of these offshore schooners you would have the relative silence of the sea, broken only by the sounds necessary to work the vessel. The low-spoken commands to the helmsman, bring her up a little, ease her now, steady as you go. The creaking of the rigging blocks, the flutter of the trailing edge of the jib to windward, the groan of the spar jaws off the wind, the curl of the cutwater, the boil and kick of the quarter wave as it flees past the fantail.